Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Vladimir Putin agrees to a ceasefire with Ukraine and a phone call with President Trump, as Trump says he's willing to talk. Meanwhile, US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff arrives in Moscow to discuss the war with a Russian president. And NATO is stepping up President Trump's words as he meets with the General Secretary of NATO to discuss America's future membership with the organization. To our top story, and Vladimir Putin has said he supports the proposals for a ceasefire with Ukraine, but there are still questions to be discussed. During a joint press conference with the Belarus leader, Alexander Lukashenko, the Russian president suggested having a phone call with his US counterpart, Donald Trump. Here's what he told reporters.
We agree with the proposals to stop the hostilities, but we proceed from the fact that this ceasefire should be such that it would lead to long-term peace and eliminate the original roots of the crisis.
Let's get a live reaction from Moscow now and speak to our correspondent, Dasha Chernyshova. Dasha, thank you for joining me. Putin has agreed to a ceasefire with Ukraine in principle. What could the next steps be?
Well, certainly the news coming from Moscow is that Moscow is not saying no, but it is neither saying a yes to the potential ceasefire in Ukraine. So at this stage, Russian president said that there are nuances which have to be elaborated, and therefore the next steps would be the negotiations on what those nuances would be. The Russian president has said that the lasting solution for Ukraine conflict is needed, and therefore he said those 30-day truces, ceasefires are not going to work because they will only give Ukraine time to rearm, and Ukraine will use those 30 days perhaps for the mobilization. But also he wondered how this ceasefire could be implemented. In his position, it is very difficult at this stage to imagine the 2,000 kilometers long front line being controlled and verified. What sort of mechanisms will be in place? And he also wondered what should happen to the Ukrainian troops while Russian army is advancing. He gave an example of the Kursk region where, according to the Russian side, the Ukrainian troops are now encircled, and wondered should Russian armed forces actually say, okay, now you can go. So there are many questions surrounding the potential ceasefire in Ukraine. But the good thing is definitely that Russia is ready to negotiate. Moscow says it will be checking its position with the United States, and definitely more talks are expected to breach the positions of these two sides.
Putin also spoke about reopening a gas pipeline for Europe. In what circumstances would this actually happen?
Well, that's right. The Russian president has said that if Russia and the United States agree on the cooperation with between them in the area of energy, then Europe could actually be secured with the cheap Russian gas, and that will be beneficial for the European countries. Now, the bottom line that Russia is trying to make clear to the Western countries all the time is that it was beneficial for Europe to receive cheap Russian gas, and then Europe itself has made a series of steps that have led to the current situation where their economies are suffering. He also has made some comments on the Western companies who would be potentially looking to return to Russia, saying that Moscow says, welcome, you can come back, but there will be no preferred mechanisms for the return of those companies. He said that they will have to work on the Russian market themselves, but this could be actually beneficial for the Russian companies that have taken the niche, that have taken the free space, because that will be leading to the fair competition.
Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow, thank you so much for joining me. Let's speak to Gabriel Noronha, Executive Director of Polaris National Security and former Special Advisor at the U.S. State Department. Good evening to you. Thank you for joining me. Firstly, Putin says he's happy to negotiate with Ukraine and agrees with the proposals of the ceasefire. But there are still lots of questions, as our reporter from Moscow was just outlining. How does Steve Witkoff and the US delegation actually navigate Russia's demands?
Well, the first thing that's important to understand is Russia doesn't want a simple and straightforward ceasefire. They want to attach conditions to it. They want calls with President Trump to get even more conditions to it. And what they're doing is they're also stalling for time because they're trying to push the Ukrainians out of the last bit of Russian territory in Kursk so that they have more leverage in the final negotiation. So again, they're not operating in very good faith here. And the question will be what penalties the United States is going to put on Russia if they don't agree to this simple ceasefire.
Also, Putin welcomed his great friend Lukashenko as the two leaders signed documents which included the guarantees of security. What do you make of the timing of this meeting and press conference?
You know, one of the things that Putin wants is he wants to try to drive NATO forces and Western forces further away from Russian borders at the same time that he's pushed nuclear deployments into Belarus and pushed all sorts of Russian troops into the Belarusian borders with Europe and NATO. And so, again, building leverage is always what he's trying to do. But there's also this double standard that he's crying foul about NATO encroachment onto his supposed sphere of influence, while at the same time, he is trying to push Russian and Russian allied interests closer and threaten NATO territories. I think one thing that we've seen over the last few years is how Belarus has turned and flopped into almost an entirely Russian agent. A few years ago, they were actually trying to fight for independence from Russia. That movement is entirely gone now.
Putin has suggested a phone call with Donald Trump, which Trump has now agreed to. But how crucial will this be? And what will both sides try to actually achieve in this phone call? We saw maximum pressure on Ukraine. Is Trump likely to do this to Moscow?
I think what President Trump wants to see is President Putin serious about peace? Or is Putin just trying to get more and more concessions out of Ukraine and concessions from the United States from this phone call? I think Putin should be a little wary of overplaying his hand. President Trump wants very legitimately to wrap this war up fast. And if he senses that Putin is trying to delay or change the terms, it might not end well for him. And again, that's when I think you might see the U.S. start putting maximum pressure on Russia, doing new economic sanctions, providing Ukraine with more advanced weapons to try to force Russia to the table here. I think Putin thinks he can use this phone call to separate Trump from his national security advisor and his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio.
Gabriel, Russia is making significant gains, as you said a little bit earlier to me, in the Kursk region. Putin says Ukrainian forces can either die or be captured. Is this the time for the US to step in and possibly provide security?
I believe that that the best way for the United States to get a good deal is to give Ukraine the means to fight for itself. And the economic and military support to push the Russians out of more of Ukraine's territory. That's the best way to get Russia to do this. And then the very vital piece, which Congress is now working on, to impose severe sanctions so that the Russian economy actually collapses. That means targeting Russian oil, gas, minerals, their full banking sector. Otherwise, Russia will believe they can continue doing this, getting more leverage out of Kursk and other regions. If they think that their economy is going to actually suffer in the next year, then they might be willing to come to the table and make a real peace.
Some US officials fear Putin would use a truce to intensify efforts to divide the US, Ukraine and Europe, and also undermine any further talks. Can Putin be trusted? And are these fears actually legitimate?
Well, Putin can never be trusted. He's a KGB officer. He's gone to war with the West over the past 15 years, and he's delighted to see the United States, Europe, and Ukraine fighting. as we have been the last month. All those fights and disagreements have only benefited Russia. It's hopeful that we are going sort of a new direction now, that Ukraine is being a little bit more cooperative with the Trump administration. So I'm hopeful that that period of bickering is over and we can have a united front. But yes, Putin absolutely wants to use that, but he's going to use that whether there's a ceasefire or no ceasefire. He's going to continue to try to divide the West from Europe using all sorts of propaganda techniques and military coercion as well.
Gabriel Noronha, Executive Director of Polaris National Security and former Special Advisor at the U.S. Department. Great to have your insights. I appreciate you joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. President Trump has threatened to impose a 200% tariff on European alcohol as the continent retaliates to U.S. President's steel and aluminium hike. Posting on Truth Social, Trump threatened the increase on alcoholic beverages unless it rose back on a 50% tariff on U.S. whiskey. Now, the UK Prime Minister has announced plans to abolish NHS England, the organisation which runs the country's National Health Service. Keir Starmer told Parliament he was scrapping the arm's-length body to bring management of the NHS back into democratic control. It's hoped the change will cut red tape and allow the health service to focus on parents whilst providing more money for nurses. The former Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte has spent his first night in jail after arriving in the Netherlands last night. The 79-year-old, who was arrested this week, is facing charges of crimes against humanity at the International Criminal Court over his deadly war on drugs. And residents in Naples have spent the night on the streets and in their cars following an earthquake. The 4.4 magnitude tremor, which struck in the early hours of this morning, shook buildings and brought rubble crashing down. Power supply in parts of Naples were also disrupted. In the last hour, Donald Trump has said NATO is stepping up. It comes as the organization's Secretary General, Mark Rutte, visits Donald Trump at the White House. Their meeting comes after the president threatened to withdraw the U.S. from the military alliance if its NATO allies didn't spend more on defense. Rutte, who is the former Dutch Prime Minister, has been nicknamed the Trump Whisperer after talking him around on defense spending at the 2018 NATO summit over in Brussels.
Of course, we have to see. I know that...
Let's speak to former Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO, Jim Townsend. Jim, great having you on the show. Thank you for joining me. Firstly, Russia and Belarus have accused NATO of hostile and destabilising actions in the Ukraine war. What exactly do you make of this?
Well, NATO is not involved in the Ukraine war. NATO allies individually are, but NATO as an institution is not involved there. I think that they're trying to spread some rumors about what NATO's doing. Other than what NATO is doing is putting troops into allied countries that fear an invasion by Russia. But you're not seeing the NATO flag in Ukraine.
President Trump has long pushed for NATO countries to spend more on defence. We heard about this in his first term. Is Mark Rutte the person to convince Trump to stay in NATO during this crucial meeting today?
Well, Mark Rutte has a relationship with Trump that dates back to Trump's first term, because Rutte was the prime minister of the Netherlands at the time, and they got to know each other. So I think they trust one another, or at least have a relationship. So I think Mark Rutte is the right person to talk about it. But Mark Rutte has good news to provide to Trump, talking about how different NATO is today than where it was when Trump was president the first time, and talking about what the allies are now spending on defense today and where that trajectory is going. So there's some good news there for Trump.
Ukraine has agreed to the 30-day ceasefire deal proposed by the US. Russia has previously presented 3 truce demands. One of them is no NATO membership for Kyiv. Now, will NATO refuse Ukraine membership after this? And how secure are other European countries from Russia?
Well, I think NATO has said, and the United States has said, even during the Biden administration, that they weren't ready for NATO yet. But I think Donald Trump has come in and he's already said that NATO membership was off the table for Ukraine. So it doesn't look like Ukraine will get into NATO anytime soon, or if at all. So that's, I think Putin will probably get what he wants in terms of no Ukraine in NATO. As far as the other allies, I think the 3 Baltic nations and Poland, particularly those countries, and the Nordic as well, Sweden, Finland, they feel under pressure from Putin because there's a lot of so-called gray area activity or attacks that Russia is putting onto them. Misinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, jamming of GPS signals, that kind of thing. So those countries that border Russia feel under threat from the Russians.
Something you touched on a little bit earlier, but I just want to get more from you on that. NATO has never encountered such an overhaul of global alliances. Is the world's most powerful military alliance able to transform and survive?
You know, NATO has really proven since the end of the Cold War, particularly, that it can adapt to geopolitical changes. They certainly adapted after the Cold War ended during the 1990s. As they enlarged NATO, they during the time of counterterrorism after 9/11, NATO was very involved in helping to fight terrorism, including having missions in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And now with the rise of Russia and aggressive Putin, they've risen to that challenge, and they've adapted their military strategy to handle the protection and the deterrence, the protection of allies and the deterrence of Russia. So it will survive. It will absolutely survive. And I think a lot depends on what the U.S. will do, whether, you know, how engaged the U.S. will be. But regardless, NATO will be around, and NATO will be able to adapt itself.
Jim Townsend, former Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO. Great speaking to you. Thank you for joining me.
You're welcome.
Let's take another look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. The Trump administration's cut to US aid is impacting operations on Ukraine's front line. Aid workers have revealed projects have been halted due to the suspension of funds. Ukraine was the top recipient of US aid in 2024 at over $5 billion US. Now, Germany will hold a special session to debate funds for infrastructure and changes to borrowing. Friedrich Merz, the incoming chancellor, wants to secure a €500 billion fund before the 25th of March, when a new parliament does convene. There's a chance of Merz being blocked by a larger group of far-right and far-left lawmakers. Pope Francis remains stable in hospital, according to the Vatican. New chest scans confirm that the 88-year-old pontiff's condition is improving. His doctors say there is no immediate risk of death, but have not given a timeline for his discharge. And don't let your kids be on Roblox if you're not comfortable. That's the message from the company's co-founder and CEO of the gaming website Roblox. The site is popular amongst young people and has been dogged by claims of exposure to explicit or harmful content. The Roblox boss has, however, insisted that the company is vigilant in protecting its users. Now, a NASA and SpaceX mission that aimed to rescue 2 stranded US astronauts has been postponed. The Falcon 9 launch was put on pause after a hydraulic ground issue. Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore have been stuck on the International Space Station for 9 months after complications with a Boeing spacecraft, which was deemed too unsafe to return. Sarah Firth has the story.
Environment as they're waiting for launch.
3, 2, 1. Liftoff. Delayed. The mission called off due to a hydraulic system issue with the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket, according to NASA.
The crew members of Crew 10 out of the Dragon Endurance spacecraft, another following right behind, and it looks like those are the 2 mission specialists for Crew 10, so JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi and Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov. They are now safely out of the Dragon spacecraft, followed there by NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers, and then last but not least, making her way out of the Dragon spacecraft is NASA astronaut Anne McClain.
It wasn't only Crew 10 delayed. The launch of the replacement crew of 4 astronauts to the International Space Station was set to put in motion the return of another NASA crew.
Anyone, Elsie?
US astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams have now been stuck in space for 9 months after a trip on Boeing's faulty Starliner. Wilson's statement before their takeoff proving prescient.
And we all know that when the going gets tough, and it often does, the tough get going. And you have. And Sonny and I are honored to share this dream of spaceflight with each and every one of you. So with that, LC, let's get going. Now let's put some fire in this rocket.
Greetings from the International Space Station.
Despite the delay, the 2 US astronauts have kept in good spirits through a Thanksgiving, a Christmas, and now a failed homecoming. NASA says it's now preparing to launch this Friday, and no doubt everyone will be watching anxiously for a safe takeoff for the outgoing crew and the safe return of Butch and Suni, who have been watching Earth from space and waiting to finally come back home. Sarah Firth, Al Arabiya News.
Let's take a look at the top business news now. European stocks and US futures slipped on Thursday as investors turned their attention back to an escalating global trade war. This comes after a mild rally on the back of softer than expected US inflation data on Wednesday. Stocks fell in Asia, reversing initial gains, while gold climbed to within $10 of its record peak, and the safe haven Japanese yen also ticked higher. Now, Donatella Versace will step down as creative director of fashion house Versace after 30 years in charge. She took over the label in 1997 after the assassination of her brother Gianni. Miu Miu's Dario Vitale will take over from Donatella on the 1st of April. There are reports that the fashion rival Prada, who own Miu Miu, are in talks to buy the brand. Turning to the sports news now. Boxing world heavyweight champion Alexander Usyk has been ordered by the WBO to begin negotiations with Joseph Parker for a mandatory title defense. Parker retained his interim WBO title in February with the second round knockout win against Martin Bakol. And Real Madrid have beaten rivals Atletico 4-2 on penalties to reach the Champions League quarter-finals. The last 16 tie ended 2-2 after extra time in a raucous atmosphere at the Metropolitan in Madrid on Wednesday before the shootout. Real Madrid will face Arsenal next in the last 8. Now, Turkish forces have killed 24 Kurdish soldiers in North Iraq and Syria over the past week, according to the Defense Ministry. It comes as a deal was made earlier this week between the Kurdish-led SDF and the Syrian government to integrate all military and civilian institutions into the Syrian state. This included an agreement to integrate the Druze-majority southern province of Seweda into state institutions. I'm now joined in the studio by Salah Tarif, former Israeli minister. Good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining me. First of all, you were the first Druze minister in Israel. What do you make of the integration agreement, and could accepting it be seen as declining Israel's support?
First of all, thank you for having me now. Then I was the first Israeli, not only Druze, but Arab minister in the Israeli cabinet. Then about what's happening in Syria, the situation is something else, you know. All the world is watching what's happening in Syria, and more the Druze and other minorities. We had a bad experience, really, because Mr. Jolani, Mr. Ashara, have been dominating the area of Idlib, and 18 Druze villages have been demolished, and young people and families run away and flee to Turkey and to Europe because they are Jews, not something else. The Jews in Syria have a history for the independence of this state, and they have a feeling belonging to this country. So they have the right now to be suspicious. We are watching, we are now in Israel, they are our brothers and our relatives, you know. Jews are committed to their lands, to their country. So in Syria, they love their country, but they will not give up, you know, their bodies, their history for such regime. There was a very cruel regime of Assad, and I hope it will be not the same of religious and extremists and jihadists, you know, to come here. It's not easy, and all of us are watching this very careful.
What are your main concerns for the Druze right now in Syria?
I tell you exactly. I told you about what happened in the Idlib when Mr. Jolani had been there and ruling this area. And we just, a week ago, hundreds and maybe thousands of people, kids and families have been assassinated. And nothing done of the whole world. And the Druze will not waiting for the new inquiry committee, you know, for these assassinations. It's bad signs for the new regime. And so we are obliged and we are, you know, committed to help each other in whatever, in which state they are. And to Israel, their policy for, you know, decide about security policy to expand the buffer zone in the area of South Damascus. It's Israeli policy. It's not related to Druze reality, you know. And that's why our relation with the Druze is something else. It's not related to our states, which is, you know, as enemies. It's not, no relation between Syria now in the past and Israel. So this is the complicated situation we are in.
Very difficult situation.
Yes.
What is your expectation for the future of the Druze community?
Look, it depends. If Mr. Ashara is, you know, controlling his new regime, and not, he is controlled by jihadistic, coming from Afghanistan and Pakistan and the crazy people of the whole world, you know. If this is the face of the new regime in Syria, the Jews will not agree to be a part of in any circumstances. We know all why Mr. Ashara ran so fast to sign an agreement with the Kurds, because the scene coming from Tartus and Latakia and the seashore area was so cruel and bad. And this is the situation we are. So I think the Druze, in a case that they have a place in the government, in the parliament, in new reality, I don't know if there will be democracy, you know. Ashar appointing himself as president, his friends as ministers, as a government, and others, you know. I'm living in democratic state. I will not agree with such situation. I will not want to be a part of living there. People are starving, no food, no clean water, you know. We are helping our community now, humanitarian aid.
That's what I wanted to ask you. Al-Shara obviously came in and there was a lot of hope for Syria. Yes. You know, there was a hope for change. What does it mean for the rest of the Arab world if Syria is in a safe place?
I hope that we will get another future. The experience of the past is so bad and so not good, you know. But we have to be optimistic. Saudi Arabia now trying to help Jolani. I hope they'll influence him to go in the right direction. The people of Syria, I feel sad about them, their life, you know, I know them. I met them in London, every place in the world. And they feel so bad about their family and their fate. So I hope something will change. But if you ask me honestly, I'm so worried. I'm so worried about, because I know these people now come to power, where they start and what they done in the past. I hope we'll have another future. Just not only for, it will be dangerous, not only for the Syrians. The Muslimic fanatic movement will affect Jordan, which is nearby, will come everywhere in the Middle East. I hope that will not happen. I hope we will have a new era, first of all, for the people of Syria.
Here's to a new era. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you having on. That was Salah Tarif, former Israeli minister. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, a reminder of our top stories. Vladimir Putin agrees to a ceasefire with Ukraine and a phone call with President Trump as Trump says he's willing to talk. Meanwhile, US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff arrives in Moscow to discuss the war with the Russian president. And NATO is stepping up President Trump's words as he meets with the General Secretary of NATO to discuss America's future membership with the organization. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. A special interview with Adam Borla, the US Special Envoy for Hostages and Negotiations, is coming up next, followed by The Dressing Room. And of course, don't miss Tom Burgess-Watson with GNT. Lots to watch tonight. Thank you for seeing me. Good night.